Okay, so we're going to start with this set of video lectures. This is the last set of lectures that you have for evolution. I believe this starts on page 128 in your spiral notebook. If you haven't had a chance to glue this down into your notebook yet, please just look for the slide that has the picture of the little detective with the light on it, and look for the slide that says evidence for evolution. Go ahead and take a moment to do that now. Additionally, I just would like to draw your attention to please do not just fill in the blanks on your slides and then move on. You should be, if I'm writing notes on my slides, you should be writing notes on your slides as well, because the notes that I add will be on the final exam. So it's really important that you understand the notes that I add in addition to the fill in the blanks. So if I'm adding notes, you should be adding notes as well to help you understand. So we're going to go ahead and begin. So remember, Charles Darwin had been around the world, and he came up with this idea that went against everything that had been taught up until now. And he basically had noted that based off of all the evidence that he had gathered, that he challenged that the world was not just 6,000 years old, as the Bible would have led many people to believe. And he came up with this theory of evolution, and that through descent with modification over time, that the organisms that were living had not been placed on here since the beginning of time, but yet they had all had evolved from a common ancestor through many years, more than 6,000 years. And Charles Darwin said that there was evidence for that. His evidence really came from the fossil record. So that's Charles Darwin. There were fossils there that Charles Darwin had noted that looked different than the animals that were today. But what Charles Darwin didn't realize was that there were other pieces of evidence that proved evolution to be a valid theory. And those other pieces of evidence that we'll discuss today are embryonic development, body structures, biological molecules, and lastly, how all of that ties into microevolution. So we're going to discuss each of those as we go through, but first we'll start with a definition of microevolution. So just know that 1, 2, 3, and 4 all are key pieces that help prove Darwin's theory of evolution, and microevolution explains what's going on to a population in a short amount of time. So what is microevolution? This is evolution that we can see in a short amount of time. Remember that evolution is a change in the genes, what we see in a population over time. Okay, so an example would be what we saw with the peppered moths, antibiotic resistance, and pesticide resistance in insects. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Here, I hope you can spot, probably not in your handout, but here is the peppered moth, nicely camouflaged into that tree. And clearly this tree has been cleaned of the soot that made the white moth so easily able to spot. So I know that there's nothing to fill in per se on this slide, but it is very important that you understand what's going on in this slide. So as I'm annotating, you should be annotating as well. So we're going to take a look even at the evolution of pesticide resistance, and how that acts as selection. Okay, so right here, what this is trying to show is that a pesticide is basically something that kills pests. And what are pests? They could be bugs, rodents, anything that eats crops. So you should make sure that you get that set of notes right down when you're annotating. And so the pesticide, basically, you see right here, is being sprayed. So it is basically a poison being sprayed. And the poison is targeted at working against something in the genotype of that particular bug that's going to be poisonous to it. But you're not always going to be able to kill all the bugs, because there's going to be one or two bugs, like this one right here, who is resistant to that. And as you know, it only is going to take two resistant bugs to the pesticide that are able to survive. And if there's at least two, they're going to survive and they are going to reproduce and have more and more offspring. And these offspring are going to be resistant to the pesticide. So you should think to yourself, what's going to happen next? Well, the thing is that because they are resistant, or they won't be killed, they're not going to be killed, a more poisonous version of the pesticide is going to have to be made. And we have to think about what the problem with that is going to be. If we have a more poisonous version of the pesticide that's going to be made because these animals were the ones that didn't die, how is that going to impact us in our environment? And so we have to think about this in making good choices. The next slide shows the evolution of drug resistance in HIV. And again, there's nothing for you to fill in per se on your slides here, but I do want you to add notes. And so what you're seeing right here is this is the HIV virus. So that's all virus. And the different colors means that they have a slightly different genome here. So you can see 3 different varieties exist. So there's variety 1, 2, and 3. And so when chemists make a drug, they make a drug that's going to be able to block or prevent the HIV from replicating. And remember, if there's no reproduction, then you can't spread your genome. So these guys die and they cannot pass on their genetic information. However, particularly in viruses, it just takes one that happens to be resistant. They have a gene that makes them resistant, and they don't even have to sexually reproduce. All they have to do is find a host, and they can make thousands more. And the problem with this, in the same way that there's a problem with pesticides, is that the drug that you have to make to kill this is very poisonous also to humans. And so you have to really be careful, because while you're busy killing the drug, while you're killing the virus, you also don't want to kill the human. So this is why, in part, it's important to study evolution, so we can understand how fast things evolve. So we'll move to the next slide. So one of the things that is another proof for evolution that Darwin noticed, so we're looking at different proofs now, is that the more alike organisms are, the more alike their DNA is. So the more alike two organisms are, the more alike their DNA is going to be. And that should make sense, because if you look alike something, remember, the reason why you get your looks or your phenotype is based off of your genotype. So your phenotype depends on your genotype. And so if you have wings, right? If you have wings, then your DNA tells you how to make wings for your bird, okay? So the more similar you are in terms of your looks, the more your DNA is going to match up. So what they're trying to show here is they're looking at a particular protein, which is the cytochrome oxidase gene. And the more closely related you are, the more closely related your DNA is. So between the human and the pig, for this particular gene, there's only 13 DNA base pair difference, okay? So we only have a 13 DNA difference. But if you compare the human with, say, the snake, okay, we look less like the snake. And also the DNA difference is 20 nucleotide sequences different. And then if you really compare the human all the way out to the yeast, the difference between the DNA is now 66 base pairs. And remember, the base pairs are A, T, C, and G. So that's a big difference in base pairs. But what's really, really interesting is that we all have this cytochrome oxidase gene. And we all share the base pairs A, T, C, and G, which means that we all came from one common ancestor. Right here from a long time ago at the beginning of time. Another proof of evidence to kind of continue to talk about biological molecules is the similarity in DNA sequences. So that's what that last slide was trying to show you. The more alike two organisms are, the more amino acids they are going to have in common in their genetic sequence. So the example is that chimpanzees and humans share almost a nearly identical amino acid sequence. And remember, if we are sharing an identical amino acid sequence, this is going back this is a little bit of review. Remember, our DNA makes RNA, and our RNA makes proteins, and our proteins are made out of amino acids. So that's a little bit of review for the final exam there, okay? So if our DNA is very, very, very similar to the chimpanzees, then our proteins are going to be very, very, very similar to the chimpanzees. And remember, what do proteins do in our body? This should be a review. Our proteins are enzymes. They're used for structure, immune function, etc. Okay, so the more further apart our DNA is from another organism, because our DNA ultimately is the recipe for proteins. If our DNA is very far apart from another organism's DNA, then our proteins are going to be very, very different as well. So another piece of evidence that proves evolution is occurring in organisms is this concept of homologous body structures. And homologous body structures are related structures, okay, so they're related structures that are basically inherited from a common ancestor, So structures have, these structures have different mature forms, but they develop from the same embryonic tissues. Okay. There's strong evidence that all four-limbed animals with backbones, this is important here, backbones, descended with modification from a common ancestor. So again, this is really important. If you have a backbone, then you are a vertebrate, okay? So what they're trying to show in this particular picture is that a human is a vertebrate, has a backbone. A cat is a vertebrate, it has a backbone. A whale is a vertebrate, it has a backbone. A bat is a vertebrate, and it has a backbone. And we're all related, and you should be able to see that there are some structural similarities, even though we're looking at four different things. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit in the next couple of slides. So let's kind of look more at this concept of homologous body structure. So remember, this prefix right here, homo, that means the same, okay? So we've talked about this before. So homo means the same or similar. So homologous body structures, we're really talking about scientists noticed animals with backbones, the vertebrates, had similar bone structures. Although the particular limb might differ in form or function, the limb bones develop in similar patterns. So these, for example, would be perhaps the arms of a human, or the wings of a bird, or the legs of a cat, or the flippers or fins of a whale. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in the next slide. So this is a close look at homologous structures. You're going to get a chance to work with this a little bit more. I do want you to label this slide because you should know the different bones here and what they're trying to talk about, okay? So in homologous structure, you have a similar structure, but different function or job, okay? So let's talk about what that means. Well, if you think about the job of each of these structures, the job of an arm or a hand is to grab. The job of the forelimb of a dog is to walk. The job of a bird wing is to fly. And the job of a whale fin is to swim. So you can see their jobs are all different. However, you should see that they have some similar structures, and we're going to talk about that. And you do need to mark up your own slide because this will be really important to your understanding. So if you look at this bone right here, the one in brown on all of the limbs here, they all have the same bone, and that bone is called the humerus, okay? So in each of these structures, that's the humerus, okay? Additionally, they have some more bones that are similar. So the next bone that's similar that they all have is this bone called the ulna. So that's given in red. So there's the ulna there, there's the ulna there, and that's the ulna there. And they have a little bit different shapes, but they all exist, okay? And you're going to get the idea pretty quickly. The next bone that's similar in all of them is this one here called the radius, okay? So the one in white here, all of these structures all have a radius. And then the next structure that they have that is the same in all of them are the carpals right there in yellow. So those are the carpals right there in yellow. Those are the carpals, okay? And then after that, you might have even have broken your carpal at one time, okay? If you broke your carpal, you broke your wrist. Then in here we have the the metacarpal, which would be the equivalent of your hand. So your metacarpal is there in right there, okay? And then lastly, we have what would be your phalanges, which would be your fingers. Okay, so your fingers would be right here. So everyone's got a version of phalanges right there. So those are your phalanges. And so the idea is that we have, each of these have different jobs. Each of these limbs have different jobs. Grabbing, walking, flying, swimming. They all have different functions, but their structures are similar in that every one of these limbs has a humerus, an ulna, a radius, a carpal, a metacarpal, and phalanges. And so scientists use homologous structures to prove that we all came from a similar or common ancestor, which proves evolution. And remember, the reason why you get these bones in the first place is that information is coded in your DNA. So let's talk a little bit about another piece of evidence that is used to prove evolution, which is this concept of vestigial structures. So these are structures that are present in an organism, but that they serve no apparent purpose. So they happen to be there, but the organism doesn't really use them anymore for any kind of purpose. And so you should know these examples: the appendix in a human, the legs on a skink, although you wouldn't know what a skink is probably, the pelvic bone of a whale. Whales still have pelvic bones. They're very, very, very small, and they're obviously not attached to a leg. But if you have a pelvic bone, animals that have pelvic bones, they once walked. So this suggests that whales might have lived on land at one time. And they evolved to not live on land. And if they evolved to not live on land, they no longer need to use that pelvic bone anymore. So vestigial structures, they happen to be present in an organism but serve no apparent purpose. Another one that's in humans would be the wisdom teeth. A lot of people, most people get those taken out by the time that they're 18 because they don't have enough room in their mouth for that. Another piece of evidence that's used to prove evolution is similarities in early development. So embryonic structures of different species show significant similarities, and an embryo is the early stages of vertebrate development. So what you're looking at right here is an embryo of a vertebrate. You can tell it's a vertebrate because it's got its spine right there, or its backbone, okay? And it's been shown that in vertebrates, the embryos, whether you're a dolphin, whether you're a snake, whether you're a human or a turtle, that the embryo, which is developing inside the mother, looks the same. It looks the same. And the biggest thing that really makes us the same early in development is that no matter whether you're a dolphin, snake, human, or turtle, we have these gill slits right here. So those gill looking kind of things. And then we have what's called a post-anal tail right there. A post-anal tail. So if you're a human, though, that tail will kind of curl back up into the body by the time you're born. But if you're a snake, you will remain with that tail. So this also kind of proves or gives evidence that evolution is real and true in the development of organisms on the planet. So here is a picture sort of to kind of give you an idea how embryos look very, very, very similar early in development. Remember, an embryo is what you're basically looking at is the baby developing inside the mother. So this would be a fish right here, and this is what the fish looks like early in development. Right here would be a salamander, and this is how the salamander looks early in development. My personal favorite is the tortoise. This is how the tortoise looks early in development. This would be a chick, and this is what the baby form or the very, very small embryonic form of the chick would look like. And if you kind of go across all of the embryos right here, there's not a lot of difference in what the embryos look like early on in stage 1 here of the development. And scientists use this as evidence that we all maybe have descended from a common ancestor because we look so much the same early on in development. So remember that one of the pieces for evidence of evolution is this concept of comparative embryology. If we compare the embryos at stage 1, they look very, very, very similar in their development. So this just gives you more of an idea up close of what all the embryos look like. Like I said, for whatever reason, I am very, very particular to the turtle. I think its little turtle shell is so, so, so cute. But then the two pieces that are really important that really kind of give away are what are called pharyngeal pouches. So these are like these gill slits right here on the side of the neck that are present in all of the embryos as they're developing in the mother or in an egg in the case of a turtle or a chick. The last piece of evidence that is used to prove evolution is the fossil record. And the fossil record is sort of like looking at a book in the planet, preserved in the rocks in the planet. And all the information about the past life that can provide evidence about the history of life on Earth. So I like to think of the fossil record as a book. The fossil record is incomplete, though, because not every organism that has died or ever lived has become fossilized after death. Over 99% of all the species that ever have lived on the Earth have actually become extinct, but we don't necessarily have fossils of all of those species. And you have to think about why we don't have those fossils. Remember, if a lot of our organisms on the planet lived in the ocean, think about what those organisms look like. Think about a jellyfish. Is that going to be easily fossilized? The answer is no. It doesn't have any hard parts to fossilize, okay? So many of our species on the planet that have ever lived don't have any hard body parts to fossilize. One thing that you should also recognize is that the Earth is constantly moving, so that disrupts the fossil record, and that's also what makes it incomplete. One last little piece of important thing to note is that in order for fossils to be made, okay, you have to have sedimentary rock. You have to have sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock, if you remember, and please add this to your notes, I'm going to kind of write this off to the side. There's 3 different types of rocks, right? So the 3 rocks are igneous, we have sedimentary, and we also have metamorphic. And it's going to be really hard, and you can't have fossils in igneous rock because this is basically lava. And if you threw anything into lava, it would burn up. Metamorphic rock is basically sedimentary rock that's been under a lot of pressure. and it's under so much pressure that it would crush fossils. So you're not going to find a lot of fossils there. It's much easier to find sedimentary rock because it's made out of sediments or sand that's kind of glued together. And you can see in this picture, you can see fossils preserved in the strata, which are the layers of rock. And each layer is almost kind of like a chapter in a book. Okay, it's a chapter in the Earth's history. And so you can kind of tell what's gone on over time. But remember, from earth science, there's a rock cycle. So eventually sedimentary rock is going to be worn down, eroded, maybe recycled into igneous rock or crushed into metamorphic rock. So this is in part why the fossil record is incomplete. This is a little video that we'll watch later on evolution. But what I would like you to remember are the main important pieces for evidence of evolution. And those things include, number one, the fossil record. Number two, homologous structures. Number three, biological molecules, such as DNA. And then lastly, number four, embryonic development. Please make sure that you go back and check to see that your notes are complete. You're going to use these notes to fill out a study guide from pages 122 to 130 so that you will be ready to be successful for the portion of evolution that is in your final exam.